Now the question is, what is a promise? The category is of course asynchronous JavaScript, and there will be 5 relative questions. As discussed in the previous section, callback functions are used when there is an asynchronous process. But when there are multi-level functions, it's a hell of a job, and that's why it's callback hell or pyramid of doom, which we saw in the previous section. And to save you from this hell, the promise object is invented. So in a very simple language, promise object is a better way to write those callback processes. And the best way to know this is by converting, or rather refactoring, the code we wrote in a callback function with a promise. But before we do that, let's get clear with the very basic syntax of the object promise. I'm opening the browser here, and we try few lines to understand the syntax. How do we write a promise? When I say promise, that is capital P, it's an object given by JavaScript, and we instantiate the promise by saying that I want to create a new promise. Also, I'm going to create an object. Let's say I name it PR. So I'll say let PR is equal to new promise. The constructor of promise takes one callback function which has 2 parameters. Let me first of all type the code. Without understanding anything, we just try to display the value of PR. PR is an instance of promise. The function which we give as a callback function in the constructor of promise has 2 parameters. The first parameter refers to the resolve state, and the second is the reject state. I'm coming to that, what is resolve and reject. But at the moment, let me just run and see what is the output of PR. As you see that the object is displayed, and there is a state displayed saying pending. Let me expand and see what does it display. It displays that it's an object of type promise. The promise status is pending. This shows that by default when you create a promise, there is always a pending state or pending status. Ideally, when you think of a promise, it looks something like this. The promise object which you create will have by default a pending status. So when there is a code inside promise which, let's say, has done the job successfully, then you will return the resolve state. And if it is failed, if the job is failed or there is a failure, then you can return it with reject. So in case if it is resolved or reject, there will be a further process you want to execute, which you can write with then, THEN, then. Sometimes we do call that promises are thenable. So when you say thenable, it means you can write a chain of then statement, and you can deal with various steps of a process which is taking time. What I mean to say is you will be dealing with multiple asynchronous processes with multiple thens, which you see in this figure. You see here right now the status is pending. Now let me just say that I resolve the returned value. I just say that after some job which we will add at the moment, we will add few lines here. For example, there are statements, right? And then eventually when the job is done successfully, we will say resolve. Let's run this and see what happens. Now the state is resolved. It is not pending anymore. Even if I expand this, you see it says that the promise status is resolved. Don't worry about this pending, resolved and reject. The moment we convert the callback function code with promises, you will get the clear idea how it is done. But at the moment, resolved is actually resolving the status. Now here it says undefined. In fact, this is actually the message which you want to pass. Like in our case, we can have data as well, that we will see in a moment. But right now, let me just give a message that it is successful, or maybe data processed. That's it. And now if I run this, let me clear this again and run it so that we get the clear idea. Now you see that there is a state resolved and it says that data processed. So if I expand here, you see that the state is resolved and the promise value which we actually returned with resolve, that is retrieved here. Right now I'm not giving any then statement, right? We are just trying to see how we create the object of promise and what is the behavior of a promise. Now, instead of resolve, you can certainly say reject. If you do that, in case of failure, you may have a reject statement. As you see that now, because it is reject, right, there is an error also generated, and we have the state as rejected. We do handle errors also with promises. That also we are going to see in just few moments. So this is the basic syntax of dealing with the promise. In short, when there is a success, you return resolve, and to return failure, you actually use the reject, which actually updates the state as resolved or rejected. Now let's see the syntax of promises in detail as well. Let's try to create an object with a promise. So I'll say let PR is equal to new promise. This has a callback function which we have already seen, where we further have two more functions, resolve and reject. Mind you that this resolve and reject nowadays we don't use because we already have async await. That will be our discussion in few of the next sections. Let's say I just resolve it, which we have seen that we resolve with a message. For example, I give success message, just like this. Now to deal with this promise, how do we actually write, or how do we chain the promise with the then method? So we write like this, pr.then. This also has a callback function. So I'll just write the message we want to display. Let's say the message. So when this resolve is called, it sends the data, this resolve data, to this MSG variable, which we can display. So I'll say console log, and I want to display the MSG. Now when it comes to error handling, we write catch along with then. Remember, we can have more thens like this. We will see that later on. But right now, to deal with error handler, you can write a catch here, which again has a callback function. And inside this, let's display console log error. There is also one more option with a promise, and that is finally. Finally does have a callback function, but it doesn't have any parameter within that callback function. Like in success, we have the message. In the catch, we have the error. But in finally, we don't have anything, right? It's just that when the promise is executed, when the entire job is done, whether it is resolved or rejected, at the end, if you still have some process to execute, you put it in the finally section. So let me also have a console log here. So I'll say console log, and the finishing process you can write here. So I'll say finishing process. That's it. Now let's try to execute this and see how does it behave. I'll say node the callback.js. So when I say resolve, it called back this line, that is console log, right? Instead of this, if I have to reject this in some case, let's say, and I display the message here saying that this is the error, right? Now if I run, you see the error is displayed. So this error is actually the catch section execution. Let me just add one more string here, which shows that this is the error part. I'll just join this. I'll run it again. So now you see this error, and it doesn't display the actual message. It displays the object, in fact, and finally is executed. So the finishing process is displayed. But this process is actually not an asynchronous process, right? So let's put a set timeout here. I can say set timeout. I'll put a callback function with set timeout, and let's say whether it is going to be resolved or rejected, but after 2000 milliseconds. Let's resolve, and we say success, or maybe some message, let's say data. Now if we run this, after 2 seconds, you will get the message. So this is a common syntax of writing a promise. At the moment we have configured the object PR and are handling the promise. It might also happen that you have a function which has an asynchronous process. Then you can return a promise, and the function which returns a promise is also thenable. That means right now we have returned then with the PR object, which is actually of type promise. But if we have a function, then that also becomes thenable. We already had the square function we defined with callback function. Let's change the CSQR, that is custom square function, with this syntax. So this callback function gets converted to promise. This conversion is also called as promisification, or I am promisifying, or promisify. All these terms are related. So I am converting the code of callback to promise. The CSQR we had, let me write the same way. I'll say CSQR this takes, for example, one parameter. It's an arrow function, so I'll put an equal to and arrow, right? And this has the parameter a in it. Now this code which I have here, I'm going to cut this and paste it inside this function. Now what I want is, instead of PR, I should write CSQR and I should pass the value here, right? So it should return me the result. I can say MSG, but let me say result, more meaningful variable. So I'll say result here. That's it. Is it going to work or not? Let me run this and show you why it's not working. The error says that cannot read property then. It means that still this function is not thenable, because by default a function cannot be thenable. When will it be thenable? When can I add the then or catch? When this function returns a promise. So now the only thing I have to write is it returns a promise. I'll say return PR. That's it. Now let's try to run and see whether we get the desired output or not. 2 seconds waiting, and then the data is displayed, right? Unfortunately, I'm not giving the square, so let me do that. I'll say a into a. That's the data we want, not the data string. Let's run this again. 2 seconds waiting, and we have 4. That is the square of the value we passed using the promise. We can still improvise this code. I do not need this PR object, right? I can simply say, let's not write this. I'll say return. It is one and the same thing, and I don't need this return statement. This is a more appropriate and lesser line code that you write return new promise, and that does the job. Let me run it again to show that there is no change. To make sure that it's a new code, I'll just change this value and run it again. So we have 9 here, which shows that it is perfectly configured. In the same way, we can change the code which we had, which was fetching the data and displaying the data, right? We converted that code into callback function earlier. Let's promisify that fetch data and display data code with promise. So this is the code of callback, right? Let's run this once to make sure that everything is fine. So the program starts, the data is retrieved, and then the program ends because we had a callback function. Now if we have to convert this code into promise, then the fetch data should return a promise. So certainly you can write an object PR is equal to new promise, and at the end you return this PR. But we have already seen that instead of writing this way, I can directly say that you return a new promise, right? So this I'm sure you are clear with. So I will have a callback function in it, and this set timeout code I'm simply shifting to this return statement. Alright, so now this function is returning a promise which we need to configure with then. So now the fetch data will be called, and then we attach the then method with it, which will have a callback function. Let me also say resolve here and reject, and when it is supposed to return something, I'll say resolve the data. So the data which we are passing is, let's say, retrieved here on this place. Now this console log data I can put here, right? Because I want to display. We don't need this function anymore. But yes, see this line which we wrote earlier, which is executed at the end, certainly I can say dot catch, which will have again a similar syntax, and this will also have finally, and inside finally you can put this line, the last line. So this is something, a kind of process which is executed at the end of the job, whether it is successful or failure, doesn't matter. Here in the catch we'll have the error object, so you display the error. So I'll say console log and the error. So now this function fetch data returns a promise, right? And it resolves with this data, and that data should be retrieved here and it should be displayed. In case if there is any rejection, which is always conditional. Right now we are using resolve itself, but there might be a condition, and on that you reject. So that will be retrieved here, the rejected data. And finally something which is getting executed. So now we have configured this. Now let's run. Now we have the same code written like this, where we have the fetch data and which is returning the promise, and it handles the asynchronous process. Let's go back to square function now. In the callback section, we did see that if you have multiple processes, let's say this was the callback function where we were trying to find square of 2, and then whatever result we receive, it is further squared, and that can go on and on. So this is a multiple process we are doing, right? One process, one asynchronous process does return a result. Then you go on the next asynchronous process. It again returns a result, and you keep on adding this. The similar thing if you have to implement with promise, then one way is that after the result is returned here, you write this entire process like this, finally and everything, for example. Finally, not necessary you write every time, but catch is something which you always write. Now, if you have more lines like this, let's say the result which we retrieved here, that we are passing, right? So now after every 2 seconds, we should get the next square, right? So I can remove finally so that it doesn't confuse you a lot. Time being, I'm removing finally for the inner function at least, not for the outer promise. So now we have the first execution that will be executed and will return the result, and that will be retrieved here in this case. Let's run and see what is the output. The first value passed, it says that success and 4. The second promise, inner promise, is executed, and then it says 16. But this is very clumsy. This code is not something which you would be comfortable with. So promise gives you a choice where you can chain. So chaining the promise is very important. How will you do that? Let's try that. I'm rewriting the entire thing. So I'll say CSQR. The 2 is supposed to be passed. Then you do have that function, and here you will get the result, right? So inside this, you will write console log result. Now I want to chain this further. So I'll say dot then, right? The next result which is passed, that I want inside this. So I might say result 1. So I'll get a result 1 here. Let's say console log, and I want to display the result 1 here. And at the end, I have the catch, which will just display the error if there is any. So I'll say error and console log error. That's it. This is a proper way of chaining the promise. So the earlier syntax was very complicated, but this one is not. But this will not work as well. Why? Let me discuss that. But first, we execute it and see what is the output. So after 2 seconds, it did execute and returned 4. But for the next promise, it did not give us the result. The reason is that we need to return the promise from this then as well. Because you want to move ahead, you want to have a next call of CSQR with this result. So what will you do? You'll simply call, you'll say return the CSQR, and here you are going to pass the result which you have retrieved in this first then. So this will return the promise, and further it is going to chain with this then. Let's run this and see how does it execute. We have 4 and 16. So now you can properly chain this. If you, let's say, want to add one more then certainly you will say return the CSQR. In short, every then should return a promise when you are chaining the promise with multiple processes. Do make sure that you always write a return with a promise. So this is all about the basics of promise, and we have seen that how do we return a promise, how do we convert the callback function to promise, and we have also seen that how do we chain the promise in a proper way. Let's discuss relative questions of this topic. The first question is, how will you configure a process which should be executed at the end of promise after resolve or reject? So here you can use the finally putting the code in the finally section will make sure that whether the promise is resolved or reject, but it does execute at the end. Second question, what is chaining the promise? Explain the syntax. This we have already seen that when it comes to chaining, we do not keep on writing multiple promises in a nested pattern, but instead we make sure that we return a promise inside every then, so the next chain will be executed properly. The third question is, what will be the output of the given code? Now this code does have a promise and there are two resolve statements. It is also chained with two thens here. So if you are thinking that first resolve will be for this and the second resolve will be for the set timeout, that won't happen. Resolve or reject is like a return statement. So once it is executed, even if you have more lines after resolve or reject, those are never executed. So this will only return the resolve with data over, and that does the job. So it will wait for 2 seconds, but it will not resolve with this. It will just resolve with the over message. Let's save this and try executing it to get the clear idea. You see, 2 times over is displayed, 2 seconds it waited and it came out. The reason is that once you have the resolve statement executed, it doesn't proceed further with any more resolves or rejects unless they are put in different if conditions. The fourth question is, what is the status of promise by default? We already saw earlier that when you have the object created with promise, it has the pending status, that is the pending state by default. Fifth question is, what will be the status of promise when resolved or rejected? In case of resolved and rejected, it will have a status fulfilled or rejected.